Hi everyone, welcome to Module 3. In Module 3, we are going to talk about catching up with the Borgman reading, which is a disciplinary view of a collection, digital or otherwise. And then we're going to do an introduction to Taylor and Joudre and discuss how a collection is organized. There are levels of verification and authority in what is sometimes called the sociology of knowledge. And we're going to look at the disciplinary view from an older model and then kind of discuss how it's been not so much undermined as is definitely in the process of evolving into a very different world. So this older model talked about the primary literature, the secondary literature, and the tertiary literature. And in each of the sort of major disciplines, which are usually thought of as science, social science, and the humanities, the view of what is considered primary literature, secondary literature, etc., is different. And we're going to go through each one of those using this older model as a lens to see what kinds of materials are involved in each one of these. I'd like to start with a view from another LIS scholar who I appreciate quite a bit. He wrote a book called Secondhand Knowledge, an inquiry into cognitive authority. So he asked the question, what should hold authority for us? When we say that libraries include authoritative information, what do we actually mean by that phrase? And Patrick Wilson wrote that the apparent unconcern of librarians and information scientists for the difference between information and misinformation, joined with the apparent assumption that libraries are simply storehouses of knowledge, and the literature of science and scholarship simply the written record of the continual production of knowledge. He thought of this as a problem, which is when you do a search, and we know this from Google, when we do a search, Google doesn't care whether it brings back facts or fiction. It's bringing back an answer to your inquiry. It's matching the words that you're looking for with materials that are out there on the web. And actually, our libraries were much the same way. We often had information that was outdated, that was possibly biased for one group or another group, but we like to think of ourselves as sort of being neutral. And, you know, people make their own knowledge from the information that we provide. But Patrick Wilson thought this was a problem, and I think you'll see that it plays out as a problem and things that we talk about throughout the rest of this semester. So there are disciplines, these sort of major categories of knowledge production, to use one phrase that's in the literature. And these disciplines are obviously very aligned with departments in particular universities. So there's a department of philosophy and there's a department of biochemistry. But one of the issues is that there are now interdisciplines. So there's biochemistry. There's not just chemistry and biology. There's biochemistry. There's neurobiochemistry. There's, we keep adding qualifiers to the names of disciplines. And there are also subdisciplines, and there are non-disciplinary approaches. But each of those approach information in a different way, and we're going to look at some. So Borgman says that the sciences are more cumulative than the other disciplines. In other words, you don't just, make up an experiment out of nowhere. It relies on information that was done last year, and that information was based on information that was done the year before, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as somebody said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. That's very true in science. Whereas in the humanities, you're much more, there's a lot more creativity, there's a lot more individual stamp on the thought process that happens. And I think it's still fair to say that science is at one end of that continuum, the humanities is at the other, and sort of in the middle are the social sciences. Information science was built for science information. I know that sounds a little redundant, but it really was science that pushed the fact that we needed to have better control over the information that was being produced. We needed to be able to find it faster. We needed to be able to share it more easily. And that kind of pushed the development of information science, especially the information that came out of World War II. There was an awful lot of science and engineering going on during World War II, including the Manhattan Project and all of that research that surrounded that project. And then the whole, race to the moon, information that was produced by NASA, huge amount of research and development was going on. And like I said, people needed to share that information, sometimes across great distances. So you didn't necessarily want to have paper documents going from one place to another place. So databases were developed, descriptions of materials that were being developed were automated. And like we said last week, the documentalists were there before World War II, but this idea of accelerating this kind of information organization was definitely heightened after World War II. Okay, so what's primary literature in science? What objects are created in science that are considered primary? We can think of data files in formats like Excel, lab notebooks. At least a few years ago, when I interviewed some scientists about how they keep information, most of them said that they still use a lab notebook of some kind, a sort of chronological handwritten document that says this is what we did today and this is the kind of information that we produced. We produced these files, we did this. So it's sort of a document outside of a digital environment that keeps track of what is being done in the lab. So where are these kinds of primary literature held? Well, they're held in data repositories, some in archives. I know that at MIT, the archives held some very important lab notebooks from scientists who worked there during World War II. And how are they organized? Often these materials, especially the data repositories, are organized by discipline-specific language using very strong authoritative headings and conventions. So one particular example of this kind of primary literature repository is the National Climate Data Center, which actually happens to be in Asheville. So here's the data repository, the World Data Center for Meteorology, and you can see here's a listing for the data set curator on a particular data set. So these are actual weather readings that have been made throughout the world, and the actual data files are kept and stored in this particular facility. And some of them are available for download. And you can see there are things listed here like the technical documentation, example software, and then you can actually download the data. This new ability to keep track of data has created a number of different positions in academic libraries. There are data plan managers that work with faculty to keep track of their data by creating a plan with them. You know, this is what data you're going to create, this is how you're going to keep it, this is how we're going to archive it eventually. And the phenomenon of big data is related to this. Big data is about combining data sets from these repositories in new and unusual ways. So, like I said, a lot of them were very disciplinary specific. And so you have the biology, let's say the records of the growth patterns of a particular jungle region, and in one repository, and then in another repository you have the weather data. So how do you put those together to create some kind of understanding of what's going on with that biosphere? And so big data is related to data repositories, which are, like I said, usually discipline specific, but you can download those two sets of data and combine them if you have the right expertise. So UNCG has a data libguide, and if you're interested in this whole area, I would definitely go and look at that. It was very detailed. Linda Kellum is a graduate of our program and has been a pioneer in this particular area, and is a really good guide. So, what is primary data in other disciplines? In the social sciences, things like survey results, interviews, focus group data. So think about what artifacts would be kept from those. And you'll see, actually, there are some repositories for this kind of data, but often they were, especially stuff like survey results, are often proprietary. because they come from those big survey institutions that we know about, like the um, hmm, well, that name is gone completely out of my head. Roper is one that I'm thinking of. There are others as well. In the humanities, the original texts are important. Um, and digital humanities collections, i.e., digital libraries, have been places where these kinds of things are being digitized and kept and preserved. One very early example, and you can still see it out on the web, is the Perseus Digital Library. When it was originally conceived, it was put out on a CD-ROM, a computerized CD, and you could search it. And what the idea was that it was for classic scholars, and it would include things like pictures of sculpture, information that came from texts. It's a very interesting um, database slash digital library that you should really take a look at. So here are some of those. There's the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research, the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture is a humanities database, the Association of Religion Data Archives. Um, the largest one is the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. Lots and lots of data from um, surveys in that particular archive. So, what are secondary? What's secondary information in these different disciplines? Um, secondary. One example of secondary information in the sciences is conference presentation, and in disciplines like engineering, computer science, other sorts of cutting edge science, this is sometimes the only publication that happens. So I looked at a database which is called the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM Publications, and you can see they've got journals, which they also call transactions, magazines, proceedings, and books. We're just going to look at the proceedings in a minute. But one thing that's very important, and that is that in most of the scholarly world, every step after data depends on peer review. The only thing to remember about that as well is that the experiment is actually built on what others have done previous to this. So here's a list of an ACM proceedings, an Association for Computing Machinery proceedings. This is data mining and audience intelligence for advertising. I hope you all know what data mining is. And you can see proceedings of the 8th International Workshop on Data Mining for Online Advertising. You're hit with data mining every day. And here's a listing of the presentations that happened, and they keep a very interesting account of what publications are being viewed on their site. And number 3, we're going to look at that, why we Twitter, understanding microblogging usage and communities. And here is that article. These particular conference proceedings are peer-reviewed, but journal articles are usually considered more deeply peer-reviewed. So, yes, somebody looks over this article and gives it a blessing, this conference presentation, I should say, and says, yes, this is a well done article, but journals are usually given more attention and more detailed peer review. Another example, of course, of secondary information is the journal article. Again, it undergoes peer review. In the social sciences, collections of book chapters are common, and because I work in education, I've had a few book chapters as well as journal articles completed. This is an example of a PubMed record of a peer-reviewed journal article. We're going to see a little bit about review articles in a minute. A review article is a very specialized form of article, primarily in the sciences, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But you can see there's an abstract, there's the title, there's the name of the journal, Clinical Rheumatology, etc. Then there are what are considered tertiary, and here's these review articles. Review articles take all the articles that have been published on a particular topic up to that time period. A research group reads those articles and basically tries to say, here's what the standard science is in this particular area. These were the best methods used. They usually do a statistical review where they show that this method that was used in this article is statistically better than a method that was used in that article. Then the comparison is there. This leads to the publication of standards and methods books. Standards are very highly used in the engineering literature. Here's the particular way that you create concrete so it stays up and doesn't fall apart when you've built a bridge with it. Methods are more about, this is how you do this particular kind of experiment. Very important in the chemical literature, for instance. In the sciences, books are considered tertiary materials because you talk about more than one experiment, usually more than one experimenter, and you're taking a long view of the literature, the last 10 years, the last 15 years, the last 20 years. In that same grouping as our textbooks, which are very important in medicine. In fact, those are some of the more important materials to collect if you've only got a very small medical section in your library. A current textbook in the different forms of medicine can be very helpful. And then an encyclopedia is considered tertiary literature as well. So, you humanities folks can tell me whether I've got this correct or not, but I think this is pretty true. Here's the primary literature are the original works, the texts that you're looking, that you're reviewing. Secondary is scholarly critiques of a text, including journal articles, some of those, conferences, some of those, and books, lots and lots of those. So, in comparison to science, the book literature in the humanities is much larger. And then there is digital humanities, which is about both using digitized texts and text mining them in new ways, and also creating products that are digital rather than necessarily something that is more textual, like journals, etc. A few of the issues that Borgman identifies is this increased collaboration in the sciences. She introduces this word called hyper authorship. And what's interesting about that is that, you know, not only is there a lot more collaboration within a discipline, but a lot more collaboration across disciplines as well. There are direct links from a finished article to the data set that lies beneath it. This is new in the last 5 to 10 years. You used to have to, if you were interested in the data that was used to create an article, you had to identify the author, write to him and say, can you share your data with me? And it might have been possible, and he or she might have been glad to do it, but it might have been impossible. But because how were you going to share it? It was on a floppy disk, or it was on some non-shareable format. So this is new, this data sharing behavior, and physics was the first science discipline to do this with a database they call arXiv. And more drafts of things are appearing on websites and in repositories. Drafts, working papers, technical reports. These were things that were very, very difficult to keep track of in traditional libraries. When I came into the library field in 30 years ago, these were very difficult to keep track of because they were often very limited number of copies of anything. Technical reports had their own database, especially government technical reports, and then you would know that such a report existed, but who actually held a copy of it was another very difficult question. But now these things are out there on the web for everybody to download and look at. In digital humanities in particular, published resources are now being split apart so that images are separate. And here's a digital humanities project called the Silk Road online, and you can see there's Chinese versions, Japanese versions, all of these different major partners. Um, they're so the originals are probably held in, five or six different countries, and but this project brings all those pieces together, and allows it to be searchable, as one database. The traditional publishers are struggling, um, and there's more and more open access materials out there. If we as librarians are only going to look at documents that are books, journal articles, etc., we will lose our relevance to the digital world. Um, One conference that's been important in the last few years is something called the Charleston Conference. Um, it brings together publishers and librarians to talk about ways they can work together to organize the digital world. And that's very important. So, what forms of information do we have to preserve and curate? I think now we're starting to realize we have to preserve and curate everything we can. Um, the new librarian will support all forms of scholarship and even creativity. Local creativity is what is being supported, especially in public libraries. Local creativity is what's being supported in school libraries. So it's not just the authoritative materials that we're being asked to curate and preserve. It's what reflects our community. As we talked about last time, the community is the most important aspect of what forms a collection. And that is definitely going to be important as you go forward in your career. So the question now is, how do we keep track of the stuff? And that brings us to why do we organize? So the last two modules and the beginning of this presentation have looked at what we include in a collection and what kinds of stuff we have in those collections. But now we're going to look at that organization piece. Why do we organize? Taylor and Joudre talk about the fact that we organize to learn. Um, we analyze information bearing objects in order to understand them and give them collective names. Um, we see an individual robin and we kind of say, "Oh, that's a bird," um, because it's easier, right? We can say, oh, that thing in the bushes is a bird. It doesn't really matter that it's a robin or a wren or anything like that. It's a bird and it's probably harmless. So we can either pay attention to it more and say, oh no, that's really a robin as a subset of being a bird, or we can just kind of say, oh, that's a bird, we're moving on. Um, we also organize to bring coherence to individual facts. We learn a lot of stuff during the day, right? We're bombarded with images, we're bombarded with information from the outside world, etc. So we learn a bunch of facts. Stock market went down, Chinese economy is sinking, the temple in Palmyra was destroyed by ISIS, a tragedy. We put two of those facts together and we, you know, we can kind of say, oh, I understand what's happening to the economy. The Chinese aren't doing so well, and now the stock market is tanking, and so is my 401k. Oh well. We organize to be able to easily retrieve individual facts at a later time. Okay, we've linked this thought about the Chinese economy and the stock market together. We can bring those two facts up a little bit more easily because they're in the same space, in the same conceptual space. So, why do we organize? Um, to understand the environment. When we make these, connections that, you know, these these are all faces, these are all human faces, um, but we can kind of say, oh, but that's my particular mother. We also reduce information into smaller chunks. We've got that thing about the Chinese economy tanking and the stock market. Um, we've put that together. Unfortunately, we also put a lot of misinformation together, but that's for another lecture. Um, we make retrieval or finding things, the findability of stuff, more possible by organizing it. In a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about information architecture and how important that is. And what that's based on is that chunking things together for people to make it easier for them to find things. So Taylor and Joudre have this three universal characteristics of information sources, no matter what the institution is. And we're going to talk about the individual institutions in a minute. But what are those three universal characteristics? Title, creator, topic. Now, the title may not be something that was given to the work by the person who created it. It might be something you have to add on afterwards, but it's still good to give things titles, right? We tend to title even the pictures that we put on Instagram, as somebody said it last week in class. We usually want to give credit to a creator. And notice this word creator, not author. Author is definitely a word that's associated with textual literature. But creator, the person responsible for a movie, the person responsible for a song, etc. And some sort of topic. What is that song about? What is that movie about? What is that book about? So bibliography was about lists of books. I think I spoke about in class um, that my friend in England worked for the Victoria and Albert Museum Library, and they still had these old lists of books that had come into the library. There was no, card catalog with a subject entry and author entry and all that kind of stuff. Just a list of books. Um, Bibliography, the word bibliography was also used as a title for listings of works on a particular topic. And, um, and of course, we still use that. We say at the end of a paper that we've written, here's the bibliography. At the end of a book is a bibliography. Um, and but now it's also primarily used as the list of books used to produce another scholarly work. And I shouldn't have used books here, should have used information resources, because it could be websites, it could be journal articles, it could be movies, it could be almost anything. The description of that work is a surrogate. I used a different word last week in the slides, and I'm going to introduce two more today. Last week I called it a representation. Other synonyms for surrogate: entries, sometimes preceded by bibliographic or a database. So the database entry, the bibliographic entry, the bibliographic record, the database record. That surrogate, that title, author, creator, that title, creator, and topic, surrogate, that says, okay, here's the least amount of information that you need in order to know whether you want to use this material or not. And it stands for this big amount of material that's a movie, a book, etc. It's a surrogate, it's a representation. So why do we create these records, entries, surrogates, representations? To identify that something exists, to identify the parts of something, pulling items together into a collection, by saying, okay, we're going to pull out these records that are about this topic, and we're going to create a collection. We're going to create a bibliography of items that are about that particular topic. We're doing selection. We're describing using or creating lists according to standard citation rules. That's description with these surrogates. So you've made surrogates before. Maybe you've never done official library cataloging, but you've written papers where you had to do a citation list, a reference list at the end of the paper. That's a bibliography. You use standard citation rules. Lots of you love MLA. I'm making you use APA. Some of you might have used music citation, other kinds of things. Providing these surrogates, this creator, title, subject, and other useful access points allows for resource discovery. And locating the item allows access. So creating these surrogates allows us to find materials that we can use later on. So I just want to show you one sort of pre-digital world bibliography. This is called the National Union Catalog, and this is a pile of them made into a Christmas tree, which I love. So these are often referred to as the big green books, and here's what their purpose was. By what letters were held at the bottom, and DLC is always the Library of Congress. We know might hold that book, might have held that book at one particular time, and then we could write to them and ask them for asked them if we could borrow it. And of course, that is all automated now through a system called Interlibrary Loan that I'm sure most of you have used in the past. So in libraries, we catalog. That's what we call it. 3 parts to cataloging: description of the item, subject, attaching a subject to it, and encoding the data. So the description of the item includes standards from AACR2, which we'll learn much more about, RDA, and something called Ferber. The subject comes from Library of Congress subject headings, LCSH, and Sears subject headings. There are many other kinds of subject headings out there in the world. Encoding of the data, or the rules for putting the data into a system, come from things like MARC, MARC 21, MARC XML, and other systems. Archives are based on sort of respect the order. How something is acquired determines how it will be described. So description is based on provenance, and things are usually by accession record. So this is the date we received it, this is who we received it from, this is what was in the box when we got it. Archives usually do put some kind of subject. The original order is respected. It's described in finding aids. We'll look at some finding aids in class. Encoding is done through a system called EAD, which is Encoded Archival Description. Museums use a system of description based on categories for the description of works of art. They have controlled vocabularies for the subjects, the artwork, the kind of artwork that it is. There's a standard called the Thesaurus for graphic materials. And encoding is done through cataloging cultural objects, CCO encoding. Of course, we're not the only information organizations in the world. Records management is very important. Electronic health records are most important right now. Patent information is kept by businesses. When did we, file for a patent? When was it approved? What was the contents of the patent application? Keeping track of individual creative works, especially in a creative endeavor like a film studio, for instance, because you might want to reuse a sound stage, etc. A theater group wants to keep track of costumes, etc. And there's a field of business called knowledge management that talks about some of the processes that are used, especially patent information for companies, processes that are sometimes not explicated but only known by a single person, are tried through knowledge management, they try to capture these kind of elusive bits of information that belong to a particular person before they leave the company, retire, etc. So collectively, libraries, archives, and museums are sometimes referred to as cultural heritage institutions. And there are differences. Libraries have copies of things for which many copies were probably made. And of course, there's notable exceptions of those. But, you know, libraries are mostly about um, collections of multiply created items. Archives and museums have materials that are unique, and they're more concerned about where that item came from, the provenance that is given the objects. So that's all I have for now. I hope you like this introduction to sort of a disciplinary view of what we organize and a very preliminary look at how we organize and why we organize. So in class, we'll review some of this material. We'll discuss the Serbo reading, and we will do a description classification exercise. So I'll see you next week.